It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, Private Investigator Ed Opperman. You could find me at Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting just by emailing me directly at oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com. That's the best way to get a hold of me right now. I'm really excited about today's show. We have Professor Charles Derber from Boston University. And he's written this book. He's written 26 books, and they're all topics that we're going to be covering here all the time. It's all stuff right up our alley. But this current book, with this beautiful surrealist artistic cover by his co-author Surin Mudaliar, who I'm probably butchering his name, Dying for Capitalism, How Big Money Fuels Extinction and What We Can Do About It. God only hopes we can do something about it. Professor Charles Derber, are you there?
I am. And thanks for having me, Ed. It's great to be on with you.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is one of those guests we've been talking to for almost 20 minutes off the air before we can even get started. So already you're co-author here. First, before we get into Professor Charles Derber, who is your co-author? Surin Mudaliar?
Surin Mudaliar, yes. He's he edits a journal called Socialism and Democracy, and he's a lifelong activist. He comes from South Africa and grew up in the ANC, the movement that ended apartheid in South Africa. His family was very close to the Mandela family and movement, so he was a wonderful guy to work with. And he worked particularly on the last part of the book around how you try to change a big economic system like capitalism, which people roll their eyes at the idea of trying to change our economic system, but Surin's involvement and the fact of living through, transformation in South Africa and understanding very much the history of the struggle against abolitionism in the United States sort of shows you don't have to give up on the idea that you can make big change when it really is necessary. And so the book, while it's about a very grim subject, the idea of the extinction of all life on the planet, it's not. We really didn't want to do this without making clear that there were still things that could be done that could save us. And so the book spends some time at the end really looking at that in some detail.
And again, before we get into the book, Dying for Capitalism, How Big Money Fuels Extinction and What We Can Do About It, tell us about yourself. Who is Professor Charles Derber?
Well, I have been a professor. I was probably born to be that way, Ed, because my father was a New Deal economist. So I grew up in a family where we'd sit around the dinner table and we'd talk about, the Depression. This was, of course, long after the Depression, but my father had sort of cut his teeth in that kind of field. So in a way, I'm a chip off the old block. I kind of followed. He became a labor economist, and his most well-known book was about the history of economic democracy in America. And I've written on very similar themes, although since I was a student in the 60s and 70s, I had a more radical perspective than he did. But I think when you ask who I am, I'm sort of a product of a long lineage of progressive people who have been very focused on how we create more social justice in the world. I think my writing really came just, Ed, from the pleasure of, for me, writing is a bit like a meditation. It really concentrates the mind in a pleasurable way for me, and I love the play of ideas. I love conversations, sort of like with talking with you. I've been doing a lot of them about this book, simply because conversation is part of who I am. I mean, I feel like I come most to life and to pleasure when I'm in, engaging conversations with people. So I'm happy to be here with you.
Oh, me too. 26 books. I encourage people to go to Amazon.com right now and look up Charles Derber. 26 books, politics, democracy, fascism, corporations, capitalism, climate change, war, the culture wars, culture and conversation, and social change. So all kind of topics that we cover here all the time on the Opperman Report. All right, so what's going on in this latest book, Dying for Capitalism?
Well, It's sort of based, if we were visually, with your audience, Ed, they would probably be looking at a big triangle, which is the center, the sort of core intellectual centerpiece of the book, and that triangle is what I call the triangle of extinction. And imagine a triangle. At the top is the word capitalism, and then there are arrows which represent causation. Down one side goes to climate change and environmental destruction, and another arrow on the other side of the triangle goes down from capitalism to war and militarism. And then there are two arrows back and forth between the two bottom parts of the triangle, between climate change and war, meaning climate change fuels war and war fuels climate change. Capitalism at the top fuels war, but war also fuels more capitalism. Capitalism also fuels climate change, and climate change fuels more capitalism. Sounds a little tricky, but if people could see the triangle, it would immediately become intuitively clear what we're arguing. And much of the book is both a historical and a contemporary analysis of why these causal connections exist and why they matter. Because if you want to stop climate change and save, the planet, and you want to prevent nuclear war or biological or other wars that are popping up all over the place now, you've got to have this triangle really clearly in your mind, and you also have to have ways of thinking about how they can be changed. So for example, one of the ideas in the book is to challenge what I think has become almost conventional and is quite misleading in people thinking about climate change. They think, well, all we need to do is create new technology, green technology, sort of a la Bill Gates, and the idea that somehow the technology will actually solve the problem, and capitalism will actually help because capitalism is so technologically innovative. So it seemed to me very important to take that particular thing on. It's a very American idea that if you sort of focus on technology, then you don't have to worry about social systems, political systems that are hard to change. All you have to do is get clever people who are good at, creating solar panels and so forth. And when I argue that green capitalism is an oxymoron, if you just put new technology in, you're not going to solve the problem, I don't mean to say the technology is irrelevant. I think it's important that we have, solar and wind and other renewable sources of energy. But one of the ideas that comes through in the book is that this sort of focus on technological solutions. It diverts people from thinking more carefully and more deeply about the larger social and economic and political forces that are driving climate change. So even, for example, when you think about, maybe I should get an electric car, it's probably a good idea if you have to do a lot of driving and you don't have good public transit to get an electric car. But an electric car, a new world of electric cars, one, we know is going to produce all kinds of new highways, new searches for rare minerals. That's going to mean going into more countries like Afghanistan and other places where you might have to need war to get the right resources. And it just overloads. Building an electric car itself produces an overload of resources and production that will still add to environmental destruction in a major way. It would be much more sensible if we could convert as much of our transit as possible, as has happened in much of Europe, toward public transportation, or walkable cities where people can walk to work or walk downtown, or use bicycles, or just what this suggests is, rather than, technological change often creates just more technological problems and problems that the new technology itself breeds. And one of the sort of insights I think people will get when they read this book is seeing that how important it is to think sort of more holistically, to realize that when you're dealing with something like climate change or war, there are kinds of almost obvious but not talked about ways in which our larger political system is driven by companies and by wealthy people who have a huge stake in drilling and
greed.
producing more. It's just greed, basically. Yes.
Well,
And,
let me stop you for a
it,
second. Let me interrupt you. I apologize, but what do we? Let's keep in mind the audience, right? Who's first started listening to you. They started listening to Charles Derber, and you mentioned green energy, and their eyes just glazed over, and they said, "Ugh, that whole Green New Deal, it's just a scam. It's a money-making scam by the Democrats." You know, how would you respond to that right off the bat?
Well, there's kind of two parts of that, Ed, because one, the tragedy is in America, we have a guy running for president who says the first day of office he's going to do one thing, and that's drill, baby, drill. And he's heading a party which is committed to fossil fuels. As long as they can keep, fueling profit, they're going to keep drilling. And this is one of the, to talk to your audience, if there are a lot of people out there who don't believe in climate change, it's like not believing that the Earth is flat. There's still a lot of flat earthers, and the only way I could speak to people who don't believe in climate change is say, well, how's the weather been for you lately, in terms of fires, storms, and compare them. Just take a little bit of time. We've had the hottest, there's just an awful lot of data, which I don't have to repeat here, which shows that we're in exceptionally disruptive periods of climate that almost every part of the country and part of the world are experiencing. In fact, the real big, the big, guy here is Antarctica, and the shelf that's melting now at a level that will raise sea level. It's already raising, but it will warm and raise levels of seawater. And about 60% of people in the world and in the United States live about 60 miles from a coast. So as water level rises, it produces, competition. If you live in Florida, a lot of people can't get insurance for their homes because the insurance companies realize that these homes are not going to be inhabitable. It's already happening.
That's so true. And I'm in Florida, and the only homeowners insurance you can get is government-backed homeowners insurance. And the solution to this capitalist problem is I think that for people who have not wanted to think about these issues or don't think they're real, it's just, look at what your insurance costs are going to be like, or what it's going to get to how hard it is to find a home where you're actually going to be able to live over, and where your kids might be able to live as well. So that's one thing I would say. The second thing is that I'd go back to this. I'd say read a little, do me a favor, read a little of this book about how, if you don't believe in climate change, how it is that our economic system is inherently, by its nature, is sort of addicted to taking more and more stuff out of the ground, whatever the cost is to the ground itself and to the environment, because it's the only way that big companies are going to make money, and so they sort of addict us to all the stuff we have in our house and sort of make us feel. There's a survey, Ed, that was done a few years ago. They asked young teenage girls what was their real source of pleasure, and they said, can you guess? They said shopping. Oh.
It was like shopping online, shopping at the mall, and that's not random. How do young people who are shopaholics get into it? Well, it's all over the net, over social media, it's the PR of our culture, that if you can make some money and show it off and enjoy the really big house and great clothes and all that, I understand the desire to have those things, but what studies have shown that is at a certain point, when you have a lot of the basics and you're kind of secure about that, you don't need all this extra stuff. It really doesn't add to your happiness. But we keep buying because we're in a society that is addicted to more. That's sort of the problem with our economic system, with capitalism. It's kind of an infinite system placed on a finite planet. And when you have a system which says we want more and more of everything, and there is only so much land, and only so many resources, and you can only use so much of it before you do terrible damage. And in order to get those resources, you have to use your military to make sure that you have good access to them. And if you want to operate in a friendly territory where you can get cheap labor and have low taxes and low regulation, what could be better than a tax-free zone in some African country that desperately needs your money? And so that suggests, war, military expansion of our appetite for goods, expansion of where we feel like we have a need to produce, expansion and taking everything we can out of the ground and blowing it back into the atmosphere and into the air. So the system, much of the book is an effort to show how all these different, basically it's a death system. I mean, it's a way in which, and it's interesting, when I was doing some historical research for this book, Ed, I was interested to see how much wars played a role in moving us onto fossil fuel. Originally, capitalism, back in London in the early 1800s, the early industrialists thought they could use water and steam power as a way to power their factories. But then they realized that water had long been seen as sort of part of the commons, and they worried that if they wanted to take over water for themselves as kind of part of their own corporate property, that they would face rebellion by people who said, hey, water is a basic right for everybody, and so they moved away from water, not for technological grounds of efficiency. It could have been efficient as a way of producing electricity and heat, but they moved toward oil and coal because they felt it would be safer from any kind of public demand as a kind of public good that everybody should have access to. And then they moved away from coal, not because it was technically inefficient. This is again back in the 19th century, but because miners, worked together in very hard conditions, and they developed a sense of solidarity with each other. Hey, we're in the same boat, and we're in some danger down here, and so they tend to unionize them. And some of the most radical workers have been coal miners, and so they began to move away from coal toward oil, which is where we kind of ended up. And what really solidified that, Ed, was the world wars, where, when World War I came, you had this, tank warfare and the first planes, being used in war. And those are heavy-duty carbon emitters. And so, the wars, both World War I and World War II, these horrific wars, became the crucibles where the whole world, particularly in the West, the United States and Europe, moved toward oil as the foundation of their economies. And this was not based on technical necessity or efficiency. It was based, or cost efficiency, it was based on fears about what the public might not want corporations to have, or simply what was seen as essential to be victorious in warfare. So that's all part of the triangle. You can see just in what I'm talking about, that capitalism, militarism, and climate change and environmental problems are very, very tightly intertwined together. And what this book does is both historically and then laying out, particularly for the United States in contemporary time, exactly how this triangle works and exactly the ways. For every question you might have about, is this guy really right? Is this guy Derber really right that capitalism as a system breeds these, these costs to human life and to society? The book is a pretty simple read in the sense that it's written for a general public, and it's to answer exactly all the questions that we could anticipate that people would have when they hear this argument.
Yeah, we're talking about dying for capitalism, how big money fuels extinction and what we can do about it, and it's written by Charles Derber. Now, let me ask you a question. If all these issues, right, you're telling me that, okay, the problem is, we got this military-industrial complex, we're funding war, we're funding the oil industry. But if the problem there is that these huge industries, right? Because there's a lot of guys out there that don't think that's a bad thing. These people who work in Congress are getting money from these different lobbyists, from these different choices. You know what I'm saying? So they're saying, oh, yeah.
Gave $1.6 billion to Leonard Leo, who's the guy that was funding money to the Federalist Society and to these very, very conservative justices on the Supreme Court. That was supposed to be an area, an area of the court which was relatively protected from big money. But we've seen, dark money has flowed like a tsunami into not just politics, but the court system. And, when you talk about elections, I mean, every presidential cycle, you have billions and billions of dollars coming from a small, tiny number of people flowing into the political system. So, yeah, you're right that in order to change all this, you've got to change the whole way that the political system financially is operating. You've got to put, in most developed countries, there are limits set on what individual people and wealthy corporations can give during elections and lobbying. So in Europe, for example, many countries have kind of universal public financing. So some private financing can be used in many of these countries, but it's really restricted compared to the United States, where we don't even know who's funding. You can see a thing on the screen saying, this ad was brought to you by Americans for Progress and Prosperity. And that's coming from the Koch brothers, who are big oil people from Texas, and they're not letting you know that they're funding to drill, baby, drill, not because they want American progress. They want more money for Koch Industries. I call this cockamamie democracy. It's sort of like crazy democracy. And so.
But then let me ask you this real quick. I hate to keep interrupting your thought, but
interrupt away.
Okay, fine. Even if we were to get rid of dark money, get rid of PAC money, get rid of all that money, there's still so many ways. You hire relatives. You give them stock tips. There's still so many. Look at Lauren Boebert's husband or ex-husband now getting $700,000 a year as an energy consultant, worse than Hunter Biden, right? Okay.
Right,
well, you don't know how do we prevent that? You can't.
Well,
under this system.
In order to prevent it, you have to deal. Obviously, I mean, you use several times the word greed, money, and the subtitle says how big money fuels extinction. You're talking exactly about that. You're not going to solve these problems unless you find some way of getting control over big money. And you're saying that ain't going to happen. And I'm saying it ain't going to happen until you've got forces that are, mobilizing people who are enough concerned about their own health, their own well-being, their jobs. We're living in a period where, 10 people in the United States have more money than like about 175 million people, about half the population. We just have this obscene concentration of wealth. So, in a way, it doesn't take a lot to say, hey, we should limit how much goes to these 10 people. Most of them, by the way, Warren Buffett, one of them, has said it is an outrage that his secretary, who makes $35,000 a year, pays more taxes a year than he does. And, in other words, these huge fortunes and corporate wealth is hidden behind mountains of foundations, charitable trusts, non-beneficiary kind of foundations that look like they're serving the public. They have innocuous names, but that's where all the money is hidden, and the government can't even tax them. So there's a whole, we've got to mobilize people whose basic common sense interests lie in getting this money that's now going in the trillions to these billionaires and to the big military companies and to the big oil companies, and getting this money to the people who in a way are funding all these things. Because, the biggest welfare system in the United States, do you know who it's for?
The billionaire class, yeah.
Yeah, it's for this corporate welfare.
Military.
The amount of subsidies and tax depreciation, all this stuff that these corporations desperately need is coming from big government. In a way, capitalists at the top really like socialism because they like being helped by the government. They're getting enormous amounts of our dollars through taxes to subsidize their profits. When they fail, like in 2008, we bail them out with public money. We don't bail out the little guy who lost his house, but we bail out these billionaires. So, what they've done in countries like many of the European countries is they said, hey, wait a minute, this is kind of crazy, and we all need each other in some way. We all get helped, and we need, a community and, a public sector that really is what we talk about as part of our solution, which, provides really basic rights to health care and education and, basic housing and so forth as a public good that should be, instead of the money going to all these huge military and oil companies, I call it the carbon industrial complex, like the military industrial complex, it should be redirected. It's our money. It's a question of who should control that money and where should it go. It obviously should go to help those of us who are contributing, which is, the majority of the taxpayers, not these 10 billionaires. And literally, it's a tiny fraction. Yeah.
I always say that they tell us that the purpose of the military is to keep us safe and protect us from death, right? Well, how about shooting at cancer? How about shooting at some of these diseases? I got a torn bicep for like 2 years. I can't get it fixed. Shoot at that damn thing. Drop a bomb on it. Where's the money for that?
Exactly.
It makes no sense.
And the Pentagon itself, I should say, by law, the Pentagon has to every year issue a national security statement saying what is the biggest national security threat. Do you know what they've said, Ed, for the last 5 years?
Climate?
Yes.
Really?
That's exactly.
You're never going to hear that. You're never going to hear that.
They say climate change, but what they don't tell you is that the Pentagon itself is the largest institutional emitter of carbon in the world. There's no single institution. The Pentagon burns, because it relies on aviation, it relies on extremely carbon-intense munitions and so forth. So, they're warning us, the military is warning us, hey, if you want to be safe, you better, those of us people who don't believe in climate change, the military itself is saying the most dangerous threat facing you today is climate change. But then they go ahead, because they really like big military budgets and, war that keeps the Pentagon and the military-industrial complex clicking along. And so they're producing all this climate change. So we need the public involved in this, and I think education is a crucial factor in this. I mean, there's a reason, when you ask me who is Professor Derber, that I teach, because, young people are, they haven't been completely propagandized yet. They're open to new ideas. I don't teach one perspective, but I think I'm just appreciate how hungry they are, because they know that their world is in trouble and that their future is in crisis. Life expectancy is going down in the United States, and they worry that they're going to be less well off than their parents, which may well be the case. So there's an opening there.
Well, let me ask you a couple of questions then. Charles Derber, first quick question, how long have you been a professor?
Probably 4 decades.
Okay. I didn't want. I looked at your picture. I didn't want to. I had a feeling it's been a long time. Okay.
Yeah.
But now, when you talk to these kids today, and I call them kids, so I'm 61 years old myself. You talk to these kids today. Are you encouraged or discouraged by their ability to absorb information and make critical thinking and that type of stuff? Because there's a lot of TikToks out there that tell them that electric cars don't work. They're happy with that.
Right.
What do you?
And it's not just TikTok. It's the whole social media world. They tell me, because they spend 5 hours a day on TikTok and so forth, Instagram, and they have. Lisa, I teach at Boston College. You said Boston University. It's actually Boston College. Boston College is a university. We have a large, good graduate program, but because Boston University, which is right down the street, had already grabbed that name, so we're sort of Boston College University in a sense. But anyway, I'm at Boston College. Okay. And the students here, I'll tell you something, Ed, and this is, again, how big money is shaping things and creating problems with the younger generation that I feel I have some hope for. You know how much it costs to go to Boston College a year?
Yes, it's a fortune. What, $60 a year?
So it's about 92 or 93 thou a year when you include tuition, room, board, the entire cost of the year. That's so much money, and it's led, I think about 20% of the students are now finance majors just because they're trying to make money to pay back, their parents for getting them into a good school. And so big money is, taking over social media, technology, and the university itself. So in that respect, you're right that students, it's not just that they learn to like certain things on social media that you mentioned, but their attention span and their ability to think critically is kind of, they complain themselves to me all the time about how careful they have to be, how distrustful they are. They can't tell when they're, on, say, TikTok, they can't tell whether an influencer is a commercial for something or, a robot or what it is, so that it's kind of created a general distrust which kind of shuts people down. And some of them want to get off it because even though they're on it 5 hours a day, they don't think it's healthy for them. But that's the negative side. The positive side is, I have spent many years teaching, and I still love it today. And if you came and saw my classroom, I'd say it's a big class of, say, 60 people or a smaller class, you'd see a tremendous amount of animated conversation where students are really involved actively. They're not just sitting back and listening to some professor drone on. They're thinking about their own, economic prospects, their own view of how the environment is changing, about what would it mean if they had to go to war, the way I had to when I was at a draft age during Vietnam. So this is a generation, like most young generation, that is not locked in to one path. A lot of them want to go and work for, Goldman Sachs and make back their money that they have to spend for college. But a lot of them are also, I teach a course about capitalism. I wrote a book called Capitalism, Should You Buy It? And that question sort of dominates the class. And these are people in the class who are finance majors, who are really deeply, morally, ethically, personally raising questions in their own mind about, is this the right way to live my life? And as they learn more about these they read about the triangle of extinction, they think about it, they may agree or not agree to it. I try to let them keep a very open mind. But I think there are a lot of possibilities. I think in particular, one, they realize that their jobs are threatened by many things, and their lives are threatened by climate change in particular. So I think they take that in a very personal way. I think the freedoms that they're losing around everything from, women's reproductive rights to free speech, books being banned, all that kind of stuff, that doesn't go down well with them, So I think there is a lot of possibility among these young people, and I think there's still a lot of hope. In the book, as I said, the last part of the book is a fictional conversation between somebody in the year 2062, right before the anniversary of 1863, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, 100 years. And it looks back to the 2020s to today and says, how in the world did you guys back then figure out a way to get beyond all this power that big money has and actually keep us going in a kind of viable way now in the 2062? And then, it's the centennial of Lincoln's emancipation. So we talk about the abolition of slavery. And, back before the Civil War, people looked at the small number of abolitionists who were trying to abolish slavery, and they said, you guys are crazy. Slavery has been around for thousands of years, and they were right about that. But the abolitionist movement, because of the way it organized itself, the kind of people that got involved, its extreme openness and invitational flexibility, a willingness to take reformist, revolutionary, all kinds of approaches into account, using cultural change. Uncle Tom's Cabin was a huge literary bestseller. Frederick Douglass, a former slave, black guy, became the most photographed person in of the United States, realizing that pictures and culture plays a big role. Music plays a big role in culture. I know that from my own experience in the 60s and 70s. And so the book looks at how young people in particular, but how social movements in general, the people who don't have these billions of dollars, have been able to come together around songs, around common, needs for an education and for, living in a house and so forth, and have made big changes in the way systems operate. So nobody thought you could change slavery. And it happened. And it's sort of what we do in the book is look at how it happened, recognizing that we need this kind of new abolitionism today. We need to abolish the nuclear weapons that are going to threaten to. Who knows whether the current Middle East crisis could escalate? It's escalating already. American ships have been hit, as you know, from Qatar and from the Houthi rebels in Yemen. You could escalate easily this war into Syria and Iran, and then become Russia involved.
Yeah, it almost seems like that's what they're looking for, Let me ask you a question, Charles Derber. You were saying about how back in my day, the music, the music was inspiring, Bob Dylan, this, John Lennon, this stuff was inspiring, Neil Young, right? But now music is filtered through these huge multi-billion-dollar corporations, man. And how do we get leadership to lead us? Back in the abolitionary times, of course, we had leadership that had moral strength. Courage. Right. I did a whole, moral courage a couple weeks ago. It affected my life. But the thing is, how do we now, our leadership now today is filtered through these major media companies that are telling us who our leaders are and who to follow. How do we break through that?
Well, again, to go back to abolitionism, there wasn't one answer to that question, Ed. There were all kinds of people that got involved, and very different. You had socialists like William Lloyd Garrison, who was a New England intellectual and a pacifist, and then you had people like John Brown, who was a militant, kind of armed struggle sort of guy, and then you had moderates like Harriet Beecher Stowe, who was a middle-class white woman who wrote the bestseller Uncle Tom's Cabin, that played a huge role in mobilizing white middle-class people to join the abolitionist cause. And there was this cultural coming together of helping people, the Underground Railroad, which involved cooperation of ex-slaves like Douglass and all kinds of white sympathizers. And it's a little bit reminiscent of when you're seeing women today organizing to move women in red states who can't get abortion, need abortion, and are getting kind of an underground railroad in a sense to get into states further north where they can, actually have an abortion if they need one. You're seeing on the ground some elements of this, and we do have people both in politics and outside of politics who are morally outspoken and courageous. The Trumpists are a minority of the. I know that they could win the election. I worry that Trumpism. In Nevada, for example, where you are, he's running ahead right now, and so I don't minimize the power of his. But a lot of his power, I think, comes from the fact that people hate the established corporate political order, and they see Trump as having enough money of his own to move against it, and also moving against a lot of the global economic forces that are, making jobs hard for, working class people, ordinary people, and of all races. And so I think part of the problem is the Democratic Party abandoned a lot of the working class issues for these kind of siloed movements that are very restricted to a particular identity, movements that have legitimacy, but only if they're tied to looking at this broader systemic thing that we're talking about in this book, the triangle of extinction. Because all these different problems that people are facing with, whether they're black or white or female or male or gay or straight, are linked to these broader political and economic concentrations of big money and power. So I think, when you say you can't find, a guy like, it was interesting that in 2016, in the Midwest, in the Rust Belt, people who are viewed as so lefty, like Bernie Sanders, were winning. Sanders won the primary in places like Michigan and Pennsylvania in 2016. And I think it was because, like Trump, he was speaking up for ordinary people against the mainstream political establishment. So people might not have liked some of his positions, but they thought he was an honest voice speaking out for the ordinary people against the corporate establishment that was running the show here. And so I think, if we could look at a lot of examples of where those kinds of voices can be found. They can be found in parts of Congress. They can be found locally, I think, in city councils. One of the powers that Trump had is the Republicans discovered that school boards and city councils and that kind of local involvement is a real foundation for building national change and movements. Trump kind of universalized what I call resistance of the establishment to on the right. But he, like when the UAW was out on strike recently, he came out and said he thought the union was all screwed up and that people shouldn't join it. He never really, the only thing he accomplished was he cut the taxes of these billionaires by a very substantial amount. But you've got people who need to sort of, I think, progressives who have to discover that universalizing, operating at every level locally, in local city councils, and school boards are really important, local medical councils and so forth. I think people of all kinds at every level need to be part of this movement, because the triangle of extinction is our last bet. It's not like this is a game and we're just going to come out of it and it's all going to be, the whole game could be over. And so we have to be really serious about a strategy that I think that's why young people do have some hope. I think they do feel in their bones that this stuff is real, that the problems they're facing, are going to get them in their lifetime, and in a way that maybe older people don't feel. The Trumpist base is largely older. It's the younger people. They're not going to go to Trump, but they might be alienated because they see Biden as too close to the corporate establishment. And too militaristic.
Well, isn't he?
He is.
Because the Democrats are just as capitalist as the Republicans are.
Absolutely. That's in my view.
And Bernie, as much as I love Bernie, okay?
Yeah.
He didn't. We need to nationalize the oil industry. He never said that. We need to nationalize the banking industry. He never stood up and said these things, which is what a socialist should be saying.
Right.
Man.
So, but that's right, and I think you've just put your finger, Ed, on some of the key arguments we make in the book about how to change things, which is that we need a real Democratic Party, a party for real democracy, meaning that is going to really stand up for the voices of ordinary working people who don't have any voice in the current political establishment. Biden is not really, his money is going into the military in causes that are not helping ordinary Americans or the people out in the regions that are talking about, and into the oil companies. He's opening more land for drilling, despite some of the early climate initiatives. So why are we dominated by big money? Because they are paying for both parties. I call it Bush and Bush Light. And Trump's popularity reflects the kind of anger that people have, ordinary people without a lot of money have, at the corporate establishment. And that's what this movement that we describe, a kind of abolitionist movement, is growing among young people who are abolitionists. They don't want to be just work slaves their whole life, and they don't want to see their life ended earlier by a fire or a flood or by, temperature changes, the climate. And they don't want to die in a nuclear war that escalates out of the Middle East or out of, a new Cold War with China or something like that. So I think the ingredients are there. In Chinese, the
Well,
word
but
for
let me ask
crisis
you, is opportunity. But let me ask you this, okay? And I hate to interrupt you, but we only got a few minutes left.
Sure.
Dying for Capitalism, the subtitle is How Big Money Fuels Extinction and What We Can Do About it. Extinction. What I'm seeing out there is end-stage capitalism, okay? This incredible inflation, the loss of our freedoms and our liberties. We're living like slaves. We can't even afford to live 1 week to the next. That's the average person out there now.
Right.
The response, historically, correct me if I'm wrong, you're the professor, I'm just a guy, right? I'm a guy, with a microphone. But the response to runaway inflation has always been fascism, has it not?
Well, it's fascism unless we have exactly what we're talking about, unless you have a movement in which people find a solution to the things that are fascism emerged during, like in the 30s when there was a massive depression and all of Europe was going into it because there weren't progressive movements that were strong enough to respond to what was going on. So, yeah, fascism is, you're right, Ed, fascism is a response to the kind of breakdown of capitalism for ordinary people. And when you don't have, movements, left, progressive, socialist, public goods kinds of movements, which are saying, hey, this whole corporate world and corporate establishment is driving you, into perpetual depression and extinction. And, yeah, people are going to go fascist unless they believe that there really is a bunch of people out there who are working with them to get the control away from this big money and into the hands of ordinary people, into the public. That's why we talk about public goods and a public economy. Socialism is a scary word to a lot of people, although it's interesting. Democrats and young people, about when they're polled and asked, what do you feel when you hear the word socialism, about half say they feel they don't really understand it fully, but they feel favorable toward it. And when they hear the word capitalism, about half say they have a very negative association with it. They think big money. And there are super majorities in America that hate big money, both on the right and the left. Yeah. So there's a foundation there for doing what you're talking about. Calling capitalism for what it is. It's a kind of plot to make big money run everything for its own interests. And we just got to speak the truth about that and get people on board. We saw bits and pieces of that with this summer of labor, where, whether it was the UAW or the steward and stewardesses or the post office workers or the healthcare workers or the Hollywood strike people, you had more workers on strike in the last 6 months than you have had since the early 1960s. And so, and there are currents, there was the Occupy movement, Occupy Wall Street. Believe me, Wall Street is not popular. Trump runs against Wall Street. The Democrats don't run against Wall Street enough, because Wall Street is pouring money into both their parties. And so in a sense, you're right that the Democrats, there is to be fair, there is a progressive caucus, including people like AOC and Bernie, who do, talk about and support some very important changes, and they shouldn't be dismissed at all.
No, I'm not going to throw sauce at them. You're right.
Yeah, and we have an incredibly important election coming up, and the people who say, well, I hate Trump, I worry about a dictatorship, but just as giving all the power to these big money people, but I can't vote for a Democrat. I understand that, particularly on the military basis, because these wars are so horrific. What's going on in Gaza now is so, it's a nightmare beyond belief. But there are movements of people that are really speaking against it, including, as you know, people in Congress who are getting death threats, even though they're speaking up against the war in the Middle East and against the war with Russia and Ukraine, against America escalating that war, so or even supporting Ukraine the way it is. So I think there is all kinds of hope out there, and you just have to be willing to be part of the solution, and again, for me, education is a big part of it. That's why doing your show, you say you're not a professor, but you're a big part of the solution, Ed, because you reach people, and it's like people listening to conversations like we're having, and then doing some reading, and then starting their own conversations about these issues. That's how movements grow, I remember a guy back in the Vietnam era who grew up in Worcester, Mass. His father was a owner of a shoe store, very conservative. The last thing he thought of, he was a devout Catholic, went into the Jesuits for a while. Last thing he thought of was he'd ever get, into kind of a movement for change. And then he finally found himself, as he read a little bit more and he saw these on TV, these movies about people dying in Vietnam every night at dinner and so forth. Mm-hmm. And he said, hey, I got to do something about this. My spiritual, moral, I can't stand this stuff. So the way people are responding in Gaza right now. And what did he do? Well, he just went, he said, what does it mean to get involved? And he said, well, he realized it just meant going to meetings locally, and just getting to know people. And this can be online or it can be, in meetings at night. This guy for the last 40 or 50 years has been going to meetings every night. He works for local labor organizations. He's worked for the American Friends Services, which is a Quaker anti-war group. But the guy, he'll go to a meeting, of 3 people, and it'll help build. I mean, my friend Noam Chomsky, who's most of your viewers will have heard of, that guy, whatever his national prominence has been, he'll go out and go to a meeting of 3 people if he's invited. He'll come on your show. I mean, this is how the world has changed, that there are a lot of people who are ready for the conversation and ready to do something, and I get hope from the students because I have these energizing conversations every day. And from people like you, I know there are people out there who are really thinking and, creative about how to engage people with these issues. So, man, you can't give up, especially when the stakes are this high.
Well, Professor Derber, thank you so much. Charles Derber, we're out of time, and I'm glad you left off on a positive note like that, encouraging me, because I was out on the ledge ready to jump. So, Charles Derber, just talk me off the ledge. The book is Dying for Capitalism, How Big Money Fuels Extinction, and What We Can Do About It, Charles Derber and Seren Moudlier. And I really encourage everybody to look up Charles Derber, Derber, on Amazon. 26 books, all on these topics. You're not going to answer every question in one book, Dying for Capitalism. All these books, you got to get each one and check them out there. Mr. Derber, thank you so much. You got an open door. Anytime you want to come back, just let me know.
Thanks so much, Ed. Wonderful to talk to you.
Thank you, sir.
Take care.
Good night.
Bye-bye.